thank you for joining us and welcome to the IEOx also.
Thank you, Valeria. So, hi, everybody. So I think the plan is that I talk for roughly 40 minutes, and please feel free to interrupt if you have a clarification question. If you have a philosophical question which requires a deeper discussion, preferably write it down, leave it to the end, and we discuss it towards the end. But please do interrupt if you have a question. Quick introduction to myself, like additional to what Valeria already said. Basically, my specialization is natural resources and climate change, and hence, this is what I'm going to talk about. So, let me start. So, before we start, I like to quote this quote by Keynes, which is maybe one of the most famous economists of the 20th century. The master economist must possess a rare combination of gifts. He must be mathematician, historian, statesman, philosopher in some degree. He must understand symbols and speak in words. He must contemplate the particular in terms of the general and touch abstract and concrete in the same flight of thought. He must study the present in the light of the past for the purpose of the future. No part of man's nature or his institution must lie entirely outside his regard. And I guess this summarizes why I personally like economics. It combines many of the things I personally like, and the fact that I can combine those things I very much enjoy. So if you decide to study economics, you will be exposed to math, history, statistics, but also philosophy and politics. And then as you move through the years, you get the chance to specialize and to cherry pick which one out of these many options you prefer. And the one I preferred, obviously, are natural resources and climate and pollution. All right. So let's get going. So if people think about natural resources and pollution and climate change, I guess many people have two things on their mind. So the first one is exhaustibility. So to what extent should we be worried that we are running out of a natural resource, and what kind of consequences does it have? That's one question. The other one is, what are the negative impacts of the use of natural resources on the local and on the global environment? And while in some countries there is already a consensus on the evidence of human-caused climate change, there's still many debates in other countries on this issue, and I will touch on some of those things in the second half of this presentation. So the first half will discuss exhaustibility, the second half will discuss and consequence of exhaustibility, and the second one will discuss climate change, evidence for climate change, and the consequences of climate change. All right, here some basic, this is not exhaustive at all, but some basic books and papers I will rely on. So the bigger overview I typically get from Diamond and Jürgen. Diamond is one of my favorite authors. This is, for instance, one of the books he has written, Collapse. There he talks about how resource exhaustion and
Hello.
Resource exhaustion may have an impact on the collapse of civilization and how this can be avoided. And I will take the examples I'm going to use in the next 35 minutes from this book predominantly. So if you like the examples, this is the book to check. And the other one is Daniel Jürgen. It's a book on the history of the oil and gas sector. And this is in particular if you're interested in oil and gas out of the many type of resources, renewables and non-renewables. This is for the general overview. The specific papers I cherry picked because they're kind of seminal, fundamental, are have been written from the early 18th century to the early 20th century. And this is Karl von Karlowitz, Malthus, Jevons, Pigou. And I will explain the concept as we go along. So the first thing, and I think this is surprising to most people who start thinking about those things, let's discuss the two different types of resources. So you certainly must have heard of the differentiation in exhaustible versus inexhaustible, or renewable versus non-renewable resource. An exhaustible resource, typically people think of existing in some finite quantity, such that the rate of generation is trivial compared to the rate of use. And the classical examples coming to mind is oil, gold, metals. So you have a kind of a stock, and the stock is not growing, but you keep using the stock up. So at some point, you kind of think of it as being exhausted. On the other side, you have the inexhaustibility. So you have a reasonably high rate of generation or regeneration relative to use. People tend to think of forests or fish, which actually, in terms of regeneration, is reasonably fast because they constantly reproduce within a short period of time. But this taxonomy is a bit problematic. Why is it problematic? Because exhaustible resources are actually very, very difficult, and most people by now agree, even impossible to exhaust on the global level. Why is this? Well, because you first extract cheap deposits. They're close to the surface. Think of oil fields in Texas or Azerbaijan, like where the oil is very close to the surface, really easy to get to it. But over time, you kind of get rid of those stocks and you start finding stocks which are much more difficult to reach. The North Sea is another example, which is now much more difficult to reach, and extraction is much more costly. Now, if you keep pushing this, this simply means that extraction cost will increase over time because it's more difficult to reach the deposit. In economic terms, this means supply curve shifts up. And this means that the market price of the product you're actually extracting is going to increase. Demand consequently will drop. And the demand extracted will at some point start decreasing until you reach the point that a substitute becomes more attractive. Is this a crazy theoretical story, or is there some evidence that this actually happens? Well, Jevons, one of the guys I've mentioned before, 150 years ago, he predicted that coal will be exhausted in less than 100 years. Now the UK, so like 150 years ago, he said we won't have any coal left in 100 years. So by roughly 1965, because he had this model of an exhaustible resource, one stock, and that's it in mind. But the UK indeed stopped producing coal like 10 years ago. Globally, we're not even close to this. And the UK didn't stop because the extraction, the coal was completely exhausted. No, there is still lots of coal left under the ground in Wales, in the Midlands. But it's relative to the extraction costs in many other countries simply too expensive. So it's not profitable anymore to extract coal in the UK. And as a result of that, the UK is not extracting coal anymore. On the other hand, inexhaustible resource, what we call inexhaustible, such as fish or timber, forests, actually can be totally depleted. Why is that? Well, as opposed to exhaustible resources, stocks of inexhaustible resources do not have to be reduced to zero for extinction. The reason the exhaustible resource is never exhausted is because the final oil drop in the ground is infinitely costly to get out of the ground. So you will never do this. It will always be, it's very unlikely that it ever will become profitable. On the other hand, for exhaustible, what we call exhaustible resources, this may happen because you simply reduce the stock of fish or the stock of forest to such a level that they cannot reproduce anymore and they simply die out. Did this happen? Yes. We are aware of quite a few fish types which do not exist anymore due to overfishing. The mammoths, and this is an alternative theory, it didn't die out because of climate change, but simply due to overhunting. Gerhard Diamond is one of the guys also discussing it in another book. And there are many more examples. So the bottom line, I suspect many of you starting this lecture thought of exhaustible resources as being exhaustible. Reasonable given the name. But this is the wrong way to think about it. So the more appropriate way to think about it is that think of them as non-renewables and renewables, and the non-renewables, the regeneration rate is 0, oil, mining, minerals, whereas the regeneration rate is positive for renewable resources such as timber or fish. We call this finite? Sorry? There was a comment.
How you doing? Yeah. What you were describing there, we call, like fish and stuff, we call it in English, we just call them as a resource. It's finite, provided they're managed correctly. The renewable. Once they're managed correctly. Sorry, my word is wrong. Once they're managed correctly, they're renewable. So fish is renewable once it's managed correctly.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, yeah.
Sorry,
but then we agree. I guess this is my conclusion, right?
Sorry, my problem, my fault there. Yeah.
So let's now look into those. So after we clarified this, what the distinction is, let's look into running out of resource and how reasonable this is, and whether this happened to any civilization, what the consequences were, and then in the second part look at pollution and climate change. So this gentleman is maybe the first economist thinking about natural resources, and quite famous because he suggested a simple way to think about catastrophes and running out of resources. On the x-axis, here you see time. On the y-axis, you see quantity. And Malthus basically said, well, what if over time, the amount of resources which is available for people is actually growing at a very slow rate, while the number of people is actually growing at a very fast rate? And then he argues, if this will continue, if one is growing slowly and the other one is growing fast, at some point, the resources available per person will become so small that either people will start fighting over it or they will starve to death. And this is what is nowadays called the Maltusian Catastrophe. So you're exhausting your resource, or the resource growth cannot keep up with a country's population. Now again, nice simple theory. Do we have any evidence for this? First, the renewables. Gerhard Diamond provides one example, and this example is the Easter Island. The Easter Island is located in the Pacific. And if you've never heard of this, I'm sure you've seen those gentlemen. This is what the Easter Island is famous for, because the indigenous population has put many of those monuments at the coast of the island. And Gerhard Diamond describes what happened to the population, the indigenous population of Easter Island between 1200 and 1500. In particular, he describes that the island, or the population on the island, was suffering from a deforestation problem. So the population was growing faster than the forest was able to reproduce itself. So they were running into a Maltusian catastrophe. And eventually, by everything we understand so far, at some point, the people got basically consumed all the timber which wasn't available on the island, such that today there are no forests anymore left on the Easter Island. So they committed what we call ecocide. Is this inevitable? Well, Gerhard Diamond also has an example on forests using a similar time period, but a completely different part of the world, Japan. So Japan was in a similar situation a bit later, like between 1500 and 1600. Again, deforestation was a big problem. And the people in Japan were using up forests quicker than the forests were able to reproduce. What happened? The king of Japan introduced a sophisticated forest management system such that until today, forests in Japan are actually quite well managed. What happened? Well, during a large fire of what is nowadays Tokyo in 1657, most of the houses in the city burned down because most of the houses consisted of wood, of timber. And when they started rebuilding the city, they realized that the prices for timber started skyrocketing, and they understood that the timber became more and more scarce. So what they did, they started regulating it. And in particular, they specified who could do what, where, when, how, and how much with timber. So they basically controlled how much was available to consume. Later on, they also introduced incentives to increase supply by planting a tree. In fact, I think this is quite common across countries now. So there are many proverbs existing across many countries saying that there was a hand rise. Give me a second, I just finished the sentence. Essentially, suggesting that throughout your lifetime, you should plant at least one tree. And I guess these proverbs endogenously developed partly because several countries understood the importance of forest management and a continuous supply of trees. So somebody had a question. Was there a question or was it an accident? Okay, I will assume there was an accident. So this is how Japan managed this. So they started regulating forest use, and yeah. A few years later, something similar also happened in Germany, in particular in what is now Saxony, so like in the east of Germany. And here, this gentleman with a complicated name suggested a solution for that, Hans Karl von Carlowitz. And he came up with a concept which is nowadays quite famous in economics. As far as I know, he was the first one to actually introduce the term. What happened? Well, there was acute scarcity of timber in Saxony around 1700, similar like in Japan, for a slightly different reason, because there you had a mining industry which developed and smelting of ores required timber. And so they ended up consuming timber faster than the forest was able to reproduce. And when thinking about this gentleman suggested a few new concepts. The most important, maybe, the concept of sustainability. So the German term for this is Nachhaltigkeit. And the idea here is that whatever we do with an important resources, we should be able to maintain a certain level in terms of life quality. In economics, this means, in a very abstract way, simply a non-declining total consumption per capita over time. This is what economists nowadays define as sustainable, but the idea came from this gentleman roughly 300 years ago when he observed that timber was used up too fast. And again, similar to Japan, Germany, first Saxony, but later also Germany overall, started restricting the available supply in every period to guarantee sustainability. And to the best of my knowledge, the first theoretical literature on forest management actually also appeared in Germany and in Japan, potentially partly triggered because of these two events. So we have seen, if you have renewable resource and you exhaust it, your civilization may collapse, as we have seen in the case of the Easter Island, as discussed by Gerhard. But we have also seen that this is not inevitable. So in case of Japan and Germany, we have seen that as people have noticed it, they came up with solutions to overcome the scarcity and to manage the renewable resource. I've, for some reason, decided that my audience today will be predominantly consisting of Russian students. If I understand correctly, this is not correct. If I understand correctly, we're now half-half or something like that. So I will link those examples to nowadays Russia, the other country being Ireland, as far as I understand, right?
We have many visitors from Ireland today, so I guess, yeah.
Yes, okay. So if I come up with a good, clear example on what we're discussing in the next 30 minutes with regards to Ireland, I will also tell you what I know, but I'm not sure I'm as familiar with Ireland, of course. Okay, so what's the link to Russia? In terms of forestation, Russia is quite an important player. Oh, okay, great. Then let me just say it, and then please, if you have an idea on deforestation in Ireland, or forests in Ireland, or renewables in Ireland, I would be glad to hear. So in case of Russia, it's reasonably straightforward. Russia has one of the biggest shares, the biggest share in terms of global forest area. It's partly simply due to its size. And the problem is illegal logging and wildfires heavily reduced the amount of forest available. It's still not dramatic, simply because it's huge, but in the long term, it could be. And this is, of course, crucial for climate change, as we will discuss in the second part of the in the next 20 minutes, because CO2, carbon dioxide, can be absorbed by forests. So the more forests we have, the less the exhaustion, the use of fossil fuels is an issue, because part of the carbon dioxide appearing because of the use of fossil fuels can be absorbed by the forests. All right. So what about non-renewables? So I told you an example of renewables, how it destroyed a civilization, Easter Island, and how it was fixed in Germany and Japan. What about non-renewables? The example I'm best familiar with is I would argue quite a devastating one, is the small tiny island of Nauru in the northeast of Australia. So here it is. And this island in 1975 had the highest GDP per capita in the world. So it was above Qatar, it was above the Emirates. Why? Because they had huge phosphate deposits due to bird feces on the top of the island. But the thing is, they didn't properly manage the extraction of the phosphate. They simply extracted it, sold it abroad, and completely misused the money. What does it mean to misuse the money? Well, you buy things which are deteriorating, you consume things. You buy holidays for every citizen on the island, and you buy very expensive cars for every citizen on the small island, instead of using the money to invest in human capital, in development of infrastructure, or development of an industry which can help the development of the island after you run out of the natural resource. So because of this mismanagement, nowadays the island depends on Australian aid, and GDP per capita dropped to 10,000 US dollars in purchasing power parity. Is this inevitable? Well, again, the answer is no, it's not at all. A good example comes from the south of Africa, and the good example would be Botswana. So here in the north of South Africa. And it's actually a beautiful story, and I will recommend the movie, which has been made because of the story. Yes, correct. Comparable to Russia. It's a bit below Russia, but yes. So Botswana is the opposite story. So Botswana had one of the lowest GDP per capita in the world in 1966. And then huge diamond reserves have been discovered. But as opposed to Nauru, the money from the deposits was invested actually very wisely due to the king of Botswana. And nowadays, the country has roughly a GDP per capita reaching 20,000 US dollars PPP. Who is this gentleman? Well, the name is Seretse Khama, and there has been recently a movie made out of his life, how he returned to Botswana and he did many very reasonable, smart things, which contributed to the development of the country. What did he do? Well, many of the things are straightforward and not very complicated. He was surrounded by a group of trusted advisors who told him to follow what economists nowadays call the Hartwick Rule. So whatever in terms of value you get out of the ground, you don't waste it for short-term consumption. Instead, you invest it into capital above the ground, either physical capital in terms of infrastructure or human capital in terms of education and healthcare system. What's the link to Russia? Well, most of you know that in terms of global oil reserves, Russia has quite a few of them. So similar to the forests, a lot of the oil is located within the national boundaries of Russia. So how did Russia manage its reserves in the last 25 years, 30 years? Actually, when I looked into this, I was positively surprised, I have to say. So in 2004, the government of Russia introduced what is called a stabilization fund of the Russian Federation, where actually rents of the resources are invested in a diversified portfolio of foreign assets. So what did they do? They took the rents out of the ground, and a big chunk of it, they wisely invested in a diversified portfolio abroad, such that in the current version, this number is like 1 year old, they had between 65 and 70 billion US dollars in assets. For a population of around 144 million, this gives every Russian around $500. Moreover, another part was used for the development of infrastructure. So this figure I just took from the thesis of one of my students. On the x-axis, you have time. On the y-axis, you have investment spending in US dollars, in millions, on road infrastructure. And on the right-hand side of the y-axis, you have the oil price in US dollars. And what you see is that there is a strong positive correlation between the two. So as the price of oil was increasing, investment in infrastructure was also increasing. So these two things basically tell you, so this one and the previous one, that a large part of the rents of the capital, of the natural capital taken out of the ground in the form of oil, is either moved abroad and diversified to use during a negative economic shock, or invested locally into infrastructure, as the Hartwick Rule would suggest. So this is it on natural resources. This is a short introduction on how I think about renewable and non-renewable resources and what it impact. No, there was a question. I have a question. I have a question about the replacement. How can we make balance between consumption at the moment, at the stable development, at the time that we're in the recession? Okay. So let me rephrase the question. I suspect the question is that should we, during times of a recession, actually use some of the rents to buffer the negative shock to the people by allocating some of the money directly to them instead of investing it in infrastructure and portfolio? Is this correct? Yep. Okay. Yes, I agree. So I think this is exactly what such a fund exists for. It's the idea is that you want to smooth consumption and you want to avoid large shocks of consumption by partly investing the money you have in a diversified portfolio abroad, and to use the money from this fund in situations where you have a negative shock. I think this is exactly what some of the countries with the sovereign wealth fund have been doing. To my big surprise, and this is something we can discuss towards the end of the lecture, the Russian government did not. So the fund which they have been accumulating over the last 20 years and these huge amounts of money have, in my opinion, and to the best of my understanding, not been used to appropriately reduce the negative impact on consumption. In fact, if you look, I think, at the numbers of how much money we have now in the fund relative to last year, I think the amount of money increased, which shouldn't be the case given what just happened. But in principle, that's the idea. You want to smooth consumption. So let me now talk a bit about pollution and climate change. Some basic fundamentals. What's the carbon cycle? Well, plants, as I mentioned before, like trees, take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. So they create energy. Then we or other animals eat it to get the energy. And then we either die or burn, and then the CO2 again returns to the atmosphere. Or we die and we're covered in basins by stones, and we stay in there, like the biological material stays for many, many years below the ground under lots of pressure. And this biological mass, these biological organisms, turn into fossil fuels. So basically, you can think of oil, coal, and gas as trees and people and animals who died long time ago and have stayed below the ground under lots of pressure for many, many years. Now, if we now start reaching down to those reservoirs of fossil fuels and get them out of the ground, in principle, we're adding CO2 here to the carbon cycle. So we were here in an equilibrium, CO2 was absorbed by the trees, we ate it, we died, and the life cycle continued. But now we're kind of having access to these huge reserves under the ground, which accumulated over millions of years. And with a very short amount of time, we're getting it out of the ground and adding CO2 to the atmosphere. So theoretically, it's pretty straightforward that human activity should somehow contribute to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and consequently to climate change. Now, as I mentioned before, there are still surprisingly many people who don't buy this. And I will not focus on this today because we simply don't have enough time. But there is one thing which we can discuss, which is simple and straightforward. You can debate to a certain extent the link between human activity and the CO2 concentration. But you cannot debate the fact that the temperature has been increasing over the last 100 years by roughly 0.8 degrees Celsius. So this is not debatable. This is a fact. And in fact, this appears to be the case that the temperature in Moscow has increased. So here again, I use the example from Russia. So I got the data on the temperature in Moscow, and on the x-axis, you see the years, and on the y-axis, you see the minimum temperature in December in Moscow. And what you see is that it's slightly, so every square represents one observation. And the main point is what you see is that there's an increase in the minimum temperature in December in Moscow. It's still negative, but it's going reasonably fast towards zero. So the question we can ask, has there actually been a structural break in the development of Moscow temperature? What is a structural break? It's an unexpected change in the relationship between two variables. In our case, has this relationship changed within this time period? So was it initially not really increasing and then increasing fast, or initially decreasing and then increasing faster? And economics provides some tests. Okay, so you disagree? Good. I would argue this is a philosophical discussion. Let me finish and then we can discuss this. So, and basically this is what you see here. If you just conduct what economists would call an endogenous structural break test, what you see here is that the temperature in Moscow, there was a structural break in its development over time around 1960. Before 1960, the temperature, if at all, was even decreasing, and since 1960, the temperature has been increasing. And this year coincides with the year in which, in pretty much any country, any city on Earth, plus minus 10 years, temperature started increasing reasonably fast. So what's the takeaway here? The takeaway is we can debate, and people still debate, even though I think there's already lots of evidence for this, whether humans do have an impact on the global climate, but it's impossible, like it's very unreasonable to debate whether the global climate is changing. So the global climate is changing. So then let me go back to Gerhard Diamond and ask, did local changes in the climate in the past cause the collapse of civilizations? And Gerhard Diamond again has examples for this. So maybe the most famous one, this is just a summary, maybe the most famous one are the Norse. So essentially, roughly 1,000 years ago, the Vikings started exploring the northeast coast of North America, and they created some villages at the west coast of Greenland. And they stayed there for roughly 500 years. Now, from everything we know so far, they went extinct roughly 500 years ago. And the evidence we're having on their extinction suggests that they got extinct because of a combination of deforestation and a local change in the climate. So the climate, in combination with deforestation, in their case, led to the collapse of their civilization. Now, again, as in the previous part, is this inevitable? No. And here again, we have examples. So this is the northwest of Latin America, Peru. And there you had a civilization between 100 and 700 Anno Domini, the Mosh, which flourished in northern Peru. Again, the current evidence suggests that this civilization adjusted to climate change by relocating. So they initially used to be positioned in one location in the northern part of Peru, but then due to local climate change, they relocated and adjusted to the local environment. Now, while this is possible to do due to like following local climate changes, and I think this is what we're going to see in the next 20, 30 years a lot, it's unlikely that we can do this on the global level, at least not yet. So I had one more story on what happened in the UK and how Jevons discussed local pollution, and Pigou came up with ideas how to think about restricting this pollution. But since I'm already over the time limit, let me conclude. And if you have questions, I can present this to you as well. So I started with explaining to you the difference between exhaustible and non-exhaustible resources. And then we discussed whether the exhaustibility of resources can lead to the collapse of civilizations. And there indeed is evidence from history suggesting that civilizations collapse due to exhaustion of resources. But history also provided us with examples how this can be fixed. Regulation, for instance, in Japan and Germany were quite successful. And in Botswana, the reasonable use of the rents from resources has also been quite successful. Now, the use of resources is associated, in particular in case of fossil fuels, with an impact on the local and on the global environment. And at least theoretically, but also empirically, there is quite a bit of evidence on this, this contributes to a deterioration of the local environment and to global climate change. Now, this again, in the past, seemed to have triggered the collapse of civilizations in the case of the Norse. But again, Gerhard Diamond suggests stories in which there have been solutions for local pollution and local climatic changes. I'm not aware yet, unfortunately, though, about how to fix. I mean, the stories Gerhard Diamond suggests that migration was a solution to avoid local climate change. On the global level, this is difficult, that we will need to think about other measures to deal with this. All right, let me stop here. Are there any questions? So we have 15 minutes. Okay. Oh, okay. So thank you. So let me first, the slides, I suspect, so I think this is a question to Valeria, but I think they will be published.
Yeah, they will be published, and the recording will also be published on our YouTube channel. So we will send you the link today on our broadcast and Telegram. So just wait for it, a couple of hours.
Thanks. Should we be expecting more and more cases of depletion? Well, economists are not particularly good on the individual level to predict the future. And I do have the impression that given the increased awareness of the issue of exhaustion of fish or forests, people start paying more attention to this, and there seems to be some willingness to coordinate even on the global level to deal with this. But I guess it will still take some time until we come up with extremely effective methods to deal with this. I understand it's a very broad answer, but I wouldn't want to guess. Ban on turf cutting has been introduced into Ireland. So this is, so basically what happened, do I understand correctly?
Yeah.
That
it is like you spoke about how local problems can be caused. So turf is a fossil fuel, and it doesn't create a huge amount of energy per kilogram. So even
very dirty.
Beside coal, it's very, very low. So to keep our emissions down, we have banned turf cutting, and it can, because it sequesters a huge amount of carbon, but ultimately it will help us to meet our carbon goals as well. So that's an example, but we wouldn't have any huge natural riches that aren't really looked out for. You know, cows and all that are renewable, you know. But yeah, listen, that I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed what you said. Can I ask you one question?
Sure. Yes, please.
This might sound very naive, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you feel that
these are the most difficult questions in my experience?
Yeah. Do you feel that a lot of the international cooperation that has gone on, now I know a lot haven't helped either, but with regard to finding a vaccine, do you think, and the urgency that the world showed, do you think that may be replicated now that we face an existential crisis?
I think this is great. Thanks. So I think I would even say two things on this. So the first thing, how I can link this to natural resource exhaustion and climate change, is that people who have been arguing in the past that progress in technology will solve those issues are actually quite happy right now to see with which speed the vaccine has been developed. I mean, it's incredible, right? Because everybody was predicting it will take us like 1.5, 2 years, and then boom, in a couple of months, several countries already said, okay, some justified, some not justified, but several already said, okay, look, guys, we're nearly there. We nearly got this. So I think in relation to resource exhaustion and climate change, it indeed suggests that once we're at a point where everybody feels, okay, this is really bad, and we push all together, we may be able to come up reasonably quickly with solutions.
Okay.
So this is the first point. The second point on this is I hope that we have learned, the global population learned the following from the current crisis. People working on epidemics warned us in January, this is going to happen. It took pretty much everybody on Earth who has not been working on epidemics a couple of months at least to start believing them and trusting them. And I think at this point, if you're not convinced that they were right, then you're simply ignoring empirical facts. And then, well, then it's difficult to debate with you. But yeah, so everybody who is looking at the data must be convinced, look, they predicted this and they were right. If somebody predicts something and you see ex post that this really happened, your trust should increase towards this person's prediction. And I hope that people will take this lesson and apply it to the information that we receive regarding climate change in particular. People who have been working on climate change, they know what they're talking about. I'm not a big specialist because I'm doing economics and I'm thinking about the link between climate change and economics. These guys are thinking about the link between human activity, temperature, and climate change. And I think there is by now quite a bit of evidence that there is a causal link between these. So the earlier we all understand this, the faster we can get down to business and start trying to fix this. So I really think and hope that people have learned from this experience.
Okay.
How long do you think we have before it's too late to stop releasing CO2? This is again a question which I don't feel comfortable answering simply because I don't know. There are quite a few papers out there. If you're interested, I can send you links to those papers. So just drop me an email and I will send you some papers on this. But my simple answer to this is for me it's obvious that, as economists would say, there is a negative externality from using fossil fuels. So let's not wait until we destroy the earth. Let's try to force everybody to internalize this negative externality and to act accordingly. Like, we don't need to wait until it's too late. It's like if you're in a relationship with somebody, you don't think, okay, what can I do? What will I be allowed to do by my partner until the very, very end before I need to stop doing this? No, this is not how you think about it. You think about it, what do I need to do in order for this relationship to flourish and to do well? So you don't go to the extremes in those situations. And I would argue one should think similarly about the relationship between humans and nature. Okay. Do you believe that this information poses a significant threat of misinforming the general population? If so, what do you believe should be done to stop this? Okay, this is a very big question. I cannot possibly answer this, but do I believe it? Yes. I think it's a huge problem. How can this be fixed? Unfortunately, economists in the last couple of years have shown empirically that essentially people who don't want to believe something, it doesn't matter what you tell them, they won't change their mind. So there have been already quite a few experiments in the last 2-3 years. One of them is on voting the right-wing party in France. And people have been provided with information on the consequences on voting for this party. And even if they had a discussion and they convinced the people about the negative consequences of voting for this party, people still went ahead and voted for this party. So it doesn't seem to, yeah, it for a surprisingly large share of the global population, it seems to me that certain things are close to religious, so they simply believe in them, and you can provide whatever evidence you want to, they will not change their minds. How can this be fixed? This is a very non-scientific answer. In my personal experience in the last 40 years of my life, I've learned that by those people can be changed by being a role model for them. So you do something, you believe it, and repeatedly they observe what you're doing, and that this something seems to have some positive return, and then they may be able to adjust. But in the short run, informing them about something, it seems to be difficult. Okay. I was wondering, don't we have a huge gap between the private incentive to pollute, given that industries and so on, social benefit, like how do we align those incentives? Okay, so I think what you're talking about are exactly externalities. So there's a huge return from running an electricity producing power plant on coal in, let's say, China. And this huge return is simply there because to a large extent, this company is not punished for using coal. So in principle, on top of the cost of using 1 unit of coal, this company should be paying additionally for emitting carbon dioxide in the form of taxation, let's say. If you introduce this, if you force the companies to internalize this, then they will reduce using the very dirty fuels and potentially reduce the impact on global climate change. Mateusz, I'm not sure I actually answered your question. I think this is what I've read from the beginning, but could you just confirm whether I answered it or not? If not, then I will, you can also unmute yourself and...
Oh, yes, I think you answered it. So
okay.
it would be like government regulation from
yes.
those incentives, this gap. Okay, thanks.
Yes. There is one more hand being raised.
Hello.
Yes.
Do you have my voice?
Do I have your...
Do you have my voice now? Can you hear me?
Yes, 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 I hear you. I hear you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Very good. I'm Emad from Iran, and I have some research. I have some research about cultural problems to solve these kinds of problem that you refer to.
Cultural problem. Okay.
Yes. For example, in my country, I see some of that. For example, say a religious purpose, say God bless earth, and this is none of our business. I don't know. How can we solve this in other countries? I know, for example.
You mean, wait, you, just for me to understand, you mean the problem of emission or the problem of exhaustion of resources?
Both.
Both. Let's focus then on emission. And you saying that some people simply do not believe in it?
Correctly, yes.
Okay.
And when I
Yes.
speak with them, the nature need our
Look,
help.
I think
Okay.
there are two things to keep in mind. So one is, I think it depends on the country where you live in. So I grew up in Germany. In Germany, you typically have enough food on your table when you're growing up as a kid. So the parents can talk to you and think about climate change and resources and the pollution of your environment. Now, if you're growing up in, I do not want to offend anybody, but let's say Somalia, people simply don't have time to think about this. And
I know, yeah.
And I understand that they care less about climate change and exhaustion of resources, because these things for them are much more long-term. At the first stage, they need to make sure that the kids survive. So I think there is a
Yes.
huge gap between developing and developed countries. That's fine. And the second thing is related to the question Cillian said. It's indeed misinformation, and people are simply not aware of facts. And there, my impression is, do not debate too much with them. Just give your opinion, but don't try to aggressively convince them. This is all the evidence we have so far. It's not useful. You will not convince them. So just be a role model, do your thing, and then maybe it will help. Okay, and I think we're out of time.
Yeah, thank you so much for this lecture. As I've already said, it will be in the recording on our YouTube. Thank you for questions. And there are also a message that Rockwell College in Ireland is like, yeah, so the guys were with us. So thank you, Gerhard, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Pat, also thank you very much for comments and questions.
Okay, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a nice day. Bye.